So without further ado, John, it's my honor to introduce you again. Everybody knows who you are. Sold over 300 million books. You're also an amazing philanthropist who's been actively involved in all fronts with the Innocence Project, the No Kid Hungry Project, and Access to Justice for the Poor. So really exemplary outside of the writing world, but obviously incredibly successful in the writing world. John, would you like to greet our audience?
Sure. Hello, Talmage. Good seeing you again. And thanks for having me. Thanks to CAIL, a wonderful organization. I feel like I know the organization pretty well, so I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Great. Well, as you've heard, John, CAIL is in the business of promoting the more effective administration of justice, largely through educational programs. And they have a real focus on putting together actual innocence conferences. And so I know how important the issue of innocence is to you. How did you get connected with it?
It goes back to an obituary. I practiced law for only 10 years in a small town in Mississippi, and most of my work was criminal defense. Most of it was, a lot of it was court-appointed stuff. I did a lot of cases. I tried a lot of cases to juries. I had a lot of clients who were convicted, sentenced, and went to prison. I never had a client I thought was mistreated or wrongfully convicted. We had good judges. I knew the prosecutors, I knew the police. I just never thought about wrongful convictions. And somehow, even after I stopped practicing law in 1990 and started writing full time and started, kind of scouring the landscape for stories, as I still do, I had somehow missed the first wave of high profile DNA exonerations. They started in about 1995 or 96. And for some reason, I didn't notice them. And in December of 2004, as I was just flipping through the New York Times, I love their obituaries because they tell some fascinating stories about people I've never heard of. And the lead obituary that morning was about Ronald Keith Williamson, a guy from Ada, Oklahoma, who obviously had just died the weekend before. And the headline was Ronald Keith Williamson, freed from death row, dies at 53. And there was a picture of him standing in the courtroom, about to be set free. He looked confused. He didn't look like he was really plugged into what was happening. He wore an ill-fitting coat and tie. And I looked at the guy, and he was about the same age, about the same background, religion, socioeconomic circumstances. And I was just struck by the fact that guy went to death row. And I read the obituary, the rest of it, and I can almost quote it. But as I read it, I realized this was a fantastic story. He was the second round draft pick of the Oakland A's in 1972. My dream was to play professional baseball. I never made it to college baseball, but there were many in his section of southeastern Oklahoma who thought that Ron was the next Mickey Mantle. As scouts and coaches, and he was really talented. He certainly thought so. He had a big game, big attitude. And it didn't work out. He went off to play in the major leagues and barely survived the minors for a few years. And I was just fascinated by how a small town sports hero like Ron Williamson could then be devoured by his hometown and accused wrongfully, tried and convicted, and given the death penalty and sent to death row. And it was by the time I'd finished the obituary for the second time, I had my next book. I'd never written nonfiction before. Yep, that's it. Not much of a title, but then I often struggle with titles. By the time the day was over, I talked to both of his sisters. One is in outside of Dallas, one was in Tulsa. and convinced them that I was who I said I was, and I wanted to write Ron's story. And so I jumped into this. I went to Oklahoma and started digging around. I spent a lot of time there, and the more I dug, the more fascinating the story became. And I'm not a journalist. I'm not trained I'm a lawyer. Okay, that's my training. I wasn't sure how you verify sources and things like that. And I was just plowing through the dark, but every day was a new revelation. Every day was a new twist in the story that became more and more fascinating. And through that story, it took me into the world of wrongful convictions. And once I realized that there are so many innocent people in prison, it's become 15 years later, 17 years later, something I still am fascinated by as a storyteller, because every wrongful conviction is a fantastic story because of the suffering, the injustice, the waste. And I've written some of those in smaller versions. And as a lawyer, I find them deeply troubling because almost all of them could have been prevented. And we could prevent most of them today if we had the will to just do so. We change some laws, but there are thousands of them. We've had over 2,000 exonerations in the last 25 years. And that's the tip of the iceberg. So that's how I got involved with that story and wrongful convictions. It's still something I touch in some way every day.
As I mentioned in the introduction, John, after you got engaged with this subject through Ron Williamson and The Innocent Man, it didn't take long for you to get involved with the Innocence Project, and you've been on the board of it for many years.
Yeah.
So for those in the audience who don't know, what exactly does the Innocence Project do?
Our goal is to get innocent people out of prison. We believe strongly that guilty people should go to prison. Innocent people should not. 9 times out of 10, when you send the innocent person to prison, the real culprit continues his criminal activity. 9 times out of 10. The Innocence Project was founded 27 years ago by Barry Scheck and Peter Neufeld in New York. And at any given time, there are maybe 45 or 50 innocence projects, innocent organizations around the country. Most are attached to law schools. You got one in Texas, maybe more, but they pop up all over the place. Some survive and some are very successful. Funding is always a huge issue, and some close. But there's a loose innocence network around the country with all these organizations. They help each other out, but the Innocence Project in New York is the main one. It has a huge staff, and we litigate from coast to coast. We litigate in all 50 states. We have clients from all 50 states, and we go wherever we have to go to represent a client. And the cases are frustrating, laborious, maddening, and it takes a lot of time and a lot of money to get an innocent person out of prison. It's fairly easy to send one there. I've learned that. If you really want to frame somebody, it's not hard to do. There are ways to do it. And once you get that person in prison, it's very difficult to get them out. And that's what we do. And in 25 years, we have exonerated by DNA, clear biological proof, 365 men, 2 women. And in half those cases, through our work, we were able to nail the real criminal, the culprit. That's a kind of a added benefit to our work through DNA. We can, and in Ron Williamson's case, the real killer was a local thug who the police knew too well. And he was the last person seen alive with the victim the night she was murdered. And the police and Ada were too inept to put that case together, couldn't solve it for 5 years. Once he was finally captured, caught, and tested, DNA nailed him. So again, about half our cases, we are able to identify the real culprit.
Moving from your activities in the real world of innocence and wrongful convictions, let's switch over to your writing life on that subject. As a novelist, as we all know, you're in the business of creating great stories that makes people turn pages quickly, stay up late, sometimes even miss work because they can't stop reading. And you get your ideas for stories in many ways, but when you learn about a real life wrongful conviction like Ron Williamson, as you've said, it is a fascinating story.
Yeah.
In fact, you've said the stories are so good because they're so tragic. So how did the real life story of a man named Joe Bryan in Clifton, Texas, lead to your 2019 novel, The Guardians?
It's another fascinating case of a guy, Joe Bryan, who spent 35 years in prison. He was paroled about a year ago. He now lives in Houston with his brother. Just a prince of a guy, beloved high school principal. His wife was a beloved teacher in the small town of Clifton. And one night while he was away, I think he may have been in Dallas, a couple of hours away from Clifton, someone broke in their home and murdered his wife. And even though he was out of town, the police put together a theory that he had driven, back and forth that night to kill his wife. There was no motive for the killing. That from all appearances, they were very happily married and devoted to each other. There was no money involved. There was some life insurance money on each. They each had the same policy on each other. That became a big factor at trial because the prosecutor made a big deal of the fact that, Joe was going to make some money off his dead wife. Anyway, it was just the physical evidence was not there. It was concocted, and I wanted to use that story, fictionalize it in such a way to expose a huge problem we have with wrongful convictions, and that is junk science. In 70% of our exonerations at the Innocence Project, 70% involve shady forensics. We have a huge problem in this country with bogus expert witnesses who will testify about bite mark analysis and hair analysis. Those have been discredited a long time ago. Hair analysis helped nail Ron Williamson when he was finally put on trial. They were completely wrong. Later DNA testing proved that all the hair samples were not his, they were wrong. Anyway, there's so much junk science, faulty arson opinions, boot print analysis, even some fingerprint analysis. But our courtrooms are just clogged with so much junk science. We don't know how many people, we'll never know how many people are serving time now because of some bogus expert who got paid a fee to run some tests and testify. So I was really fired up about the junk science. In Joe Bryan's case, there was a flashlight that was supposedly found in the trunk of Joe's car a few days after the murder, and there was what appeared to be blood spatters on the lens, and the blood was never identified. The blood was never linked to the victim, and so they hired an expert, a blood spatter expert, who came into court with all his fancy credentials and a nice suit and nice vocabulary. And he showed the jury not the flashlight itself, but photographs of the flashlight with what appeared to be tiny specks of blood. And the jury, not that sophisticated, which is not unusual in small towns, they bought into it, and they convicted Joe of murdering his wife. The theory was he was holding the gun with one hand, the flashlight with the other, killed her in the dark. And that was a theory that the Texas Rangers put together, and they won. They sent him away for 35 years. And the story got picked up by an investigative journalist from Texas, and she wrote 2 articles about it for the New York Times Magazine. That's where I first saw it. And I became fascinated with the factual scenario, and I contacted her, went back and forth, and so the book kind of grew. So I didn't want to use Joe's real story because Joe was still in prison, and I'd already done a nonfiction book, and the nonfiction is much more complicated because it's reporting, and you have to be accurate. And I laugh and tell people in fiction, accuracy is not my strong suit because I can create anything, okay? But when you deal with real people and real screw-ups, and you make accusations, and you're a pretty big target for lawsuits. It wasn't any fun. I got sued 4 times for The Innocent Man after the book was published. Prosecutor two cops, and the hair analysis expert who was dead wrong at trial. He didn't like what I said about him. So anyway, but you have to deal with that. We won the lawsuits. They were all dismissed, but it's still not fun to have to go through that. So that kind of, it's much more work. And it took 18 months to write The Innocent Man. It takes me 6 months to write a novel. I'd rather fictionalize stuff and I've done that in other books, wrongful convictions and exonerations. It's just much easier to fictionalize the story and keep people's names out of it, but get the message across.
Mm-hmm. Now, you dedicated The Guardians to James McCloskey, who's the dean of all innocence advocates. He's been nicknamed the Exonerator. He's the founder of Centurion Ministries that you're on the board of. It's a nonprofit that's in the business of attempting to free the innocent. In fact, you wrote the foreword to James McCloskey's book, When Truth Is All You Have. Now, in the Guardians, you tell it in the first person. So my question is, as you sat down to write, were you truly looking at the plot you were creating through the eyes of James McCloskey, the fictional counterpart Cullen Post, to see the development of an innocent case firsthand through his eyes?
Yeah, the guy's my hero. He was a ministerial student at Princeton, and he got involved in a prison ministry and going to prison every day to meet with the guys. And he met a young man who, over a period of time, convinced him, Jim McCloskey, that the guy was innocent. And Jim finally believed him. And so he went to work. He started digging. He found the witnesses. It was a shady drug deal gone bad, all kinds of shady characters. And Jim plunged himself into that work, into that setting. And 2 years later, he walked him out. They walked out of prison together, and he'd been exonerated. And Jim was kind of searching for, he's an ordained Presbyterian minister now, but he wasn't sure he wanted to go into that kind of ministry. But he said it was like a light going off, the calling. He found his calling. God was telling him to represent these people and free the innocent. And he spent the next 45 years taking one case at a time, no money, no training as a lawyer or a journalist or anything, just one case at a time. And he grew the organization almost by accident into a really fine innocence group now with 65 exonerations. And but he became my hero. He wrote a book about it. I wrote the foreword. It's a fascinating story. A couple of cases take place in Texas, but they're all over the place. The stories are New Jersey, Savannah, Georgia, all kinds of settings. And he would often spend, he sacrificed everything, his family, a career, money, everything to pursue this calling. He never had time for a family. He never had time to make any money. Whatever he earned went into his work, and he's just, he's one of my heroes. So when I created the character Cullen Post, I wanted Cullen to have the background as a minister. When we meet him, he's a lawyer. He's a lawyer in Memphis, and he gets assigned to a very, very ugly case, and he just can't handle it. And that happened to a friend of mine, not in Memphis, but a lawyer I know very well, was appointed to represent a guy in just a terrible murder. And he said, I can't do this. I can't do this anymore. And he walked out and went to divinity school and became an Episcopal priest. So it's all patterned after Jim. I told Jim up front what I was going to do. And I said, you can't sue me. I got too many lawyers. You're not the suing type anyway. I'm not going to use your real name. And we're still great friends. I'm on his board.
Well, obviously your books not only tell great stories, but they enhance public awareness of this issue of the wrongful convictions and innocent people spending decades in jail. What kind of feedback did you get from people who perhaps had never before realized that this really is a problem?
Well, I'm not sure, Talmage, because I'm not really, I'm not accessible to a lot of people. I get a lot of mail and the letters are almost always, very pleasant, and they moved a person to write. They moved a person to write a check or whatever. Anecdotally, the Centurion Ministries, I mention it in my author's note at the end of the book, and I brag on it and say, this is my inspiration. It's a small organization with a small budget. If you have a few bucks, send them a check. And they have received a lot of checks since the book came out. They're still getting a lot of money from people around the world. They were shocked by the amount of the outpouring of generosity from people they'd never heard of. This happened a couple of times before. 20 years ago, I wrote a book called The Street Lawyer about homelessness in Washington, D.C. And I mentioned a couple of the shelters that I had gone to for research, and they got some very nice checks from people who were, so I mean, anecdotally, but it's hard for me to say that a certain book had a huge impact on people or policy or anything.
We have a question from the audience, Jonathan Hamilton, who's at White and Case, one of our main sponsors, and it ties into a question I was going to ask, and that is, in many of your books, in fact, most of them these days, it seems like, there is a criticism of certain aspects of our system of justice that need correcting. And so the question is, as you weave this criticism into the stories, is there part of you that's a crusader?
I don't see it as crusading. A while ago, you mentioned raising awareness. That's what I like to do. You have to be careful in popular fiction. You can't assume your readers share your politics or your religion. And so you can't stay on the soapbox. Now, obviously, when it comes to wrongful convictions, it's hard to argue that we shouldn't be working to free innocent. So that there's not much of a pushback there, although I do get some from prosecutors. But no, I don't set out to crusade. I set out to take a problem or an injustice. For example, I've written about the death penalty, wrongful convictions, obviously, mass incarceration, sentencing disparities, environmental destruction, insurance fraud. One of my favorite books is called The Rooster Bar. I wrote it a few years ago. It's about for-profit law schools and what a scam they are, whatever you want to call them. And I got really on my soapbox about that one, but it was fun to do because they shouldn't exist. But I mean, if I see an issue like that, I'm looking more I'm looking for stories, first of all, and stories about issues. For example, the opioid crisis is been raging for years, and I've got a pile of notes. It's almost something daily out of the newspapers. And I've got a dozen books now written about the drugs and the families that the Sackler family that got rich off the drug. And there's a trial right now in West Virginia, a huge trial in a small town. It's happening right now. I'm kind of watching. I have a buddy who's there. He wants to write about it. So I mean, that's one issue that I keep thinking about. Would make a great setting for a legal thriller, because again, the suffering is enormous. But there's so many moving parts with the pharmaceuticals, big pharma, the doctors, the pill mills, the families, the lawyers. I haven't got the story yet. But I'm always kind of on the prowl for something like that.
John, going back to the reasons why innocent people get convicted, you've talked about junk science. When Barry McNeil was accepting his award, he talked about jailhouse snitches, and those are important characters in The Guardians. Is anything being done to get rid of this frequently perjured testimony in our court system today?
I can't answer that. It's one of the most frustrating elements in a wrongful conviction case. You've got 7 or 8 causes of wrongful convictions. And in most cases, a combination of them all come together. Sometimes you get all 8 and you really get screwed. But I think like 70% of the cases involve the old jailhouse snitch. And it's amazing to me how this operates, because every jail has some druggie who's facing another long sentence, a career criminal, and they know how to play the game. And the cops know them, and the prosecutors know them sometimes, and they concoct this scheme where they'll feed the guy enough information about the crime, enough to make him credible. Then they'll stick the suspect in the jail cell with him for 24 hours, just randomly. Sometimes they even move the suspect to a different jail to put him in the cell with their favorite snitch. It's sick what they do. And then the snitch pops out, says, tells the cops, well, I heard he confessed to me, he bragged about his crime. So anyway, 6 months go by and they have the trial, and they bring in the snitch who's wearing a shirt and tie and got a haircut, looks presentable. And what fascinates me is the reaction from the jurors. Jurors simply cannot believe that a witness will take the stand in a courtroom in a very important trial and swear to tell the truth and sit there and just tell a fictional tale. It's stunning, and jurors fall for it. Then they'll tell another lie that, oh no, the prosecutor promised me nothing. The cops promised me nothing. I'm here, but and there's always a promise. They cut a deal a long time ago. How do you combat that? I think the judges are asleep. So many of these judges, they should have separate hearings with the snitch, with the witness. Bring him in, before the trial, and grill him, and grill the prosecutor, and under oath, have you cut a deal? You could clamp down on some of this. A lot of the stuff, Talmage, just goes back to, I call them sleeping judges. Judges who allow snitches to testify, judges who allow bogus experts to say all kinds of outrageous things to the jury. And judges are, as a general rule, don't really want to get in the prosecutor's way, because most of them are elected, and that's another problem with our system. I don't know why we elect judges. We should not elect them. They should be appointed based on merit, not politics.
Now, the Guardian's plot involves the wrongful conviction of a Black man accused of murdering a white man. Mm-hmm. They both lived in a town that was 80% white. The Black defendant had only one African-American on his jury, and the testifying policeman, the expert witness, the prosecutor, and the judge were all white. Now, we all know what's happened in the last year with George Floyd and Derek Chauvin and the resulting trial. But John, from your perspective, and I know you keep up with the news and you keep up with reading about all these legal issues, do you see anything that gives you some hope for meaningful progress in moving toward colorblind justice this year and in the years to come?
I'm not sure if we're going to get to a colorblind society. What does give me some hope is that the right people in Washington are saying the right things about meaningful criminal justice reform, and in many states. From the left, the Democrats have been pushing it for some time for human rights issues or fairness or whatever, and a lot of Republicans too. And 10, 15 years ago, we saw some movement from the right, because a lot of the Republicans are finally tired of paying for what the prison system cost us. With 2.3 million people in prison, it is crushing some of our states. The cost is enormous. Forget the money. The cost in human lives is enormous. And so there was some movement toward the middle that got sidetracked. But I think there are enough people now talking about meaningful criminal justice reform things like eliminating cash bail for minor crimes, a lot of things that we could do to take the burden off of so many of our less fortunate people. Getting back to, you started the question with the issue of color blindness, Talmage. I don't know how we're going to get there until the society decides to become more tolerant and more understanding, and we've got a long ways to go.
Thanks so much. Always a blast to talk to you.
Thanks, Talmage. Thanks, CAIL. Thanks for having me, guys. Take care.